The morning sun was just beginning to warm the streets of Atlanta when Special Agent Kimberly Davidson walked into the FBI field office, her steps echoing through the marble lobby. She'd been with the Bureau for 8 years now, and these early morning briefings had become as natural as breathing. The smell of coffee wafted through the air as she made her way to the conference room, greeting the security guard with a warm smile. Inside the briefing room, the atmosphere was focused but relaxed. Maps and surveillance photos covered the walls, and the soft hum of conversations filled the air. Davidson took her usual seat near the window, spreading out her files while listening to her colleagues discuss their ongoing cases. Today's briefing was particularly important. They were tracking a sophisticated fraud ring that had been targeting elderly residents. "All right, team," said the assistant director, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We've got some promising leads on the Highland Park case." He nodded toward Davidson, acknowledging her team's recent breakthrough. She'd spent countless hours analyzing financial records, and it had finally paid off. They had traced a pattern of suspicious transactions that could crack the case wide open. As the briefing continued, Davidson took detailed notes on her tablet, occasionally glancing at the crime scene photos projected on the screen. Her mind was already racing, plotting out the surveillance route she'd take later. This case meant a lot to her. Her own grandmother had almost fallen victim to a similar scam last year. It was personal, and she was determined to bring these criminals to justice. The meeting wrapped up around 9:30 a.m., and Davidson gathered her things, double-checking that she had everything she needed for the day ahead. She chatted briefly with her partner about their surveillance strategy, their conversation peppered with the kind of shorthand that comes from years of working together. They'd been through countless operations, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. Walking to her car in the underground parking garage, Davidson went through her mental checklist. Her badge was secured on her belt, concealed weapon properly holstered, and her backup credentials were in their usual spot in her jacket pocket. These habits had been drilled into her during training, and now they were second nature. She adjusted her blazer, making sure everything was in place, professional, prepared, and ready for anything. The unmarked FBI vehicle responded smoothly as she pulled out onto the street. The morning traffic was starting to build, but she knew all the shortcuts through this part of town. She'd grown up not far from here, and these streets held a lifetime of memories. Now, as an FBI agent, she saw them differently, not just as familiar routes, but as part of the complex web of her investigations. Davidson took a sip from her travel mug, the coffee still hot enough to fog her glasses slightly. The radio quietly played her favorite morning news station, keeping her updated on the city's pulse. She was heading toward the north side of town, where her team had identified a potential meeting spot for their suspects. The plan was to set up surveillance and monitor any unusual activity. Through her rearview mirror, she noticed a police cruiser a few cars back. Nothing unusual about that. She passed dozens of local law enforcement vehicles every day. But something felt different this time. The cruiser seemed to be matching her turns, staying consistently behind her. Davidson's instincts, honed by years of field experience, started to tingle. She maintained her speed, carefully noting each movement of the patrol car. Her training kicked in automatically: stay calm, assess the situation, be prepared for anything. The morning sun was now fully up, creating a glare on her mirrors that made it slightly harder to keep track of the vehicle behind her. But she could still make out the distinct shape of the police cruiser, and it was definitely following her pattern. As she approached a quieter stretch of road, the inevitable happened. The cruiser's lights flickered to life, casting blue reflections on the surrounding buildings. Davidson took a deep breath, her mind already running through protocols and procedures. This was about to become a lot more interesting than her usual morning drive. What happened next would not only change her day, but would become a moment that would ripple through law enforcement communities across the country. But right now, as she carefully pulled her vehicle to the curb, Special Agent Davidson had no way of knowing that this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. The flashing lights painted the interior of Special Agent Davidson's car in rhythmic bursts of blue. She could feel her heartbeat quicken slightly, not from fear, but from the natural tension that comes with any unexpected interruption. 8 years with the FBI had taught her that even the most routine situations deserve full attention. She guided her unmarked vehicle to the right side of the road, choosing a spot well lit by the morning sun. Following years of ingrained protocol, Davidson turned off the engine but left the key in the ignition. Her hands found their place at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, clearly visible to whoever was approaching. Through her side mirror, she watched Officer Mitchell emerge from his patrol car, his movements deliberate and measured. The way he walked told her something wasn't quite right. There was tension in his shoulders, a slight rigidity that spoke of more than routine caution. The tap on her window came with a firm authority. Davidson pressed the button to lower it, maintaining her professional composure. The morning air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from a nearby park, an oddly peaceful detail in this increasingly tense moment. "License and registration," Officer Mitchell said, his voice carrying that particular edge that comes from expecting trouble where there might be none. "Good morning, officer," Davidson responded, her voice clear and steady. "I'm reaching for my credentials now." She narrated her movements, a habit born from years of law enforcement experience. But before she could reach for her FBI badge, Officer Mitchell's hand shifted slightly toward his weapon. The gesture wasn't aggressive, but it was obvious. A clear sign that this situation was balanced on a knife's edge. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them," he instructed, his tone carrying an unmistakable warning. The morning traffic continued to flow past them, drivers stealing curious glances at the scene unfolding on the roadside. Davidson could feel the weight of her FBI badge against her hip, just inches away but seemingly unreachable in this moment. "Officer," she began again, her voice remaining remarkably calm, "I'm a federal agent. I'm going to slowly reach for my credentials." The morning sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the dashboard. A bead of sweat traced its way down Officer Mitchell's temple. This wasn't how he'd expected his morning to go either. The tension in the air thickened when Officer Mitchell took a half-step back. "Exit the vehicle," he commanded, his hand now resting more firmly on his holstered weapon. Davidson's mind raced through her options, each possibility carrying its own set of consequences. She'd been in challenging situations before, but this one was different. This was happening on home soil with another law enforcement officer. As she carefully opened her car door, Davidson's FBI training kicked in full force. She moved with deliberate slowness, keeping her hands visible at all times. The morning joggers and dog walkers had started to slow their pace, curious about the unfolding scene. She could hear the crackle of the officer's radio, the distant sound of birds, and the steady hum of traffic. All these normal, everyday sounds somehow making the situation feel even more surreal. Standing beside her car now, Davidson felt the morning breeze ruffle her blazer. She stood straight, professional, her posture neither threatening nor submissive. Officer Mitchell's eyes darted between her face and her hands, his training and instincts clearly at war with what he was seeing, a well-dressed, professional woman who didn't fit his initial assessment of a suspicious vehicle. "Sir," Davidson said, her voice carrying just enough authority to demand attention, but not so much as to escalate the situation, "I'm going to explain something to you, but first I need you to understand that we're both law enforcement officers." She could see the slight change in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. The moment hummed between them, heavy with possibility. Time seemed to slow down as they stood there on the sun-warmed asphalt. Other patrol cars were starting to arrive, drawn by Officer Mitchell's initial call for backup. Davidson knew the next few moments would be crucial, not just for her safety, but for what this incident could mean for law enforcement relations across the board. The sound of car doors opening and closing added to the tension, but Davidson's focus remained solely on Officer Mitchell. She'd dealt with similar situations during her career, but usually from the other side. Now, standing on this ordinary street on an ordinary morning, she was about to turn this potentially volatile situation into something entirely unexpected. The morning had grown warmer, but Special Agent Davidson felt a chill as she stood beside her car. 2 more patrol cars had pulled up, their presence drawing even more attention from passers-by. A small crowd had started to gather at a safe distance, some holding up their phones. Davidson knew that whatever happened next would likely end up on social media within minutes. "I'm going to reach for my credentials very slowly," Davidson announced, her voice carrying across the growing silence. She could see Officer Mitchell's internal struggle, his training telling him to maintain control of the situation, while something in her demeanor made him hesitate. The backup officers stood at the ready, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. A delivery truck rumbled past, its driver slowing down to catch a glimpse of the scene. Davidson kept her focus on Officer Mitchell, recognizing the pivotal nature of this moment. She'd been through countless training scenarios at Quantico, but this was different. This wasn't a drill. This was real life unfolding on a suburban street on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning. "My FBI credentials are in my jacket pocket," she continued, her words measured and clear. "I'm going to reach for them now." The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the pavement as she moved with deliberate slowness. Her fingers brushed against the leather case containing her badge, a familiar touch that had never felt so significant. Officer Mitchell's radio crackled to life, dispatchers requesting an update. The sound seemed to break through the tension momentarily, reminding everyone that this was still a professional interaction between law enforcement officers. Davidson could see the uncertainty in Mitchell's eyes, the growing realization that this situation might be more complex than he'd initially thought. "Stop right there," Mitchell commanded, his voice slightly less certain than before. One of the backup officers had stepped forward, picking up on the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Davidson froze mid-motion, her hand still halfway to her pocket. Years of experience had taught her that these moments required patience above all else. A school bus passed by, children's faces pressed against the windows, adding another layer of complexity to the situation. Davidson thought about the message this scene was sending to those young observers. She knew that what happened next would matter not just for her and Officer Mitchell, but for everyone watching. "Officer Mitchell," she said, noting the name on his badge for the first time, "I understand your position. I've been where you are. But right now, we're creating a scene that doesn't need to exist." Her words seemed to reach something in him, perhaps the recognition of a shared professional experience, or maybe just the calm rationality in her voice. The tension in the air was almost visible now, like heat waves rising from the asphalt. Another police car arrived, this one unmarked, likely a supervisor responding to the situation. Davidson kept her breathing steady, knowing that escalation often happened in these moments when too many factors came into play at once. The growing crowd had gotten closer, their murmurs creating a low background hum. Some were openly recording now, their phones held high. Davidson could hear fragments of their conversations, speculation about what was happening mixing with commentary about law enforcement interactions in general. "I'm going to show you something that's going to change this entire situation," Davidson said, her voice carrying a quiet confidence. "But first, I need you to understand that we're both on the same side." She could see her words landing, watching as Officer Mitchell processed them. His hand had relaxed slightly on his weapon, though his stance remained alert. The morning traffic continued to flow around them, creating an odd contrast, the normal world going about its business while this intense scene played out on the roadside. A jogger stopped at the corner, earbuds dangling, drawn into the drama unfolding before them. The backup officers exchanged glances, picking up on the shifting dynamics. Davidson knew the next few moments would be crucial. She'd seen situations like this go both ways, spiral into unnecessary conflict or transform into moments of understanding. The weight of her FBI credentials seemed to grow heavier in her pocket, a symbol of both the problem and its solution. The supervisor had stepped out of their car now, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. But Davidson kept her attention on Officer Mitchell. She recognized something in his stance, a professional trying to do his job right, caught in a situation that had taken an unexpected turn. It was this recognition that made her next decision so important. What happened in the next few minutes would either become another headline about law enforcement conflict or something entirely different, a moment of transformation that could ripple through both their departments and beyond. As Davidson prepared to bridge the gap between their perspectives, she knew she was about to turn this confrontation into an opportunity for change. The critical moment had arrived. Special Agent Davidson stood in the morning sun, surrounded by police cars and curious onlookers, knowing her next actions would define more than just this moment. She thought about every training session, every difficult situation she'd handled, and knew this one needed something different, something more than just showing her badge. Officer Mitchell, she began, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to surprise him. Before I reach for my credentials, I want to tell you about the case I'm working on right now. She noticed his eyebrows lift slightly. This wasn't the response he'd expected. The backup officers exchanged glances, clearly intrigued by this unusual turn. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe, a mundane detail that somehow made the scene feel more real. Davidson continued, "There's a group targeting elderly residents in Highland Park. They've stolen life savings, retirement funds, everything these seniors worked their whole lives for." She watched understanding begin to dawn in Mitchell's eyes. "My own grandmother almost fell victim to a similar scam last year," she added, letting a personal note enter her voice. "That's why I was heading north when you spotted me. We've identified a possible meeting location for these suspects." The humanity in her words seemed to cut through the tension like a warm knife through butter. Officer Mitchell's stance shifted almost imperceptibly. The hand that had been resting near his weapon relaxed slightly. The growing crowd of onlookers had fallen silent, drawn into this unexpected conversation. Even the birds seemed to pause their morning songs, as if sensing the importance of the moment. "Now," Davidson said, maintaining eye contact with Mitchell, "I'm going to reach for my FBI credentials very slowly." This time, her movement met no resistance. The leather wallet felt cool in her hands as she carefully extracted it from her pocket. The morning sun caught the gold badge inside, making it gleam as she held it up. Officer Mitchell stepped forward, examining the credentials with professional thoroughness. Davidson could see the mix of emotions crossing his face: surprise, respect, and something else. Recognition, not just of her authority, but of their shared mission to protect and serve. "I could file a complaint about this stop," Davidson said, watching Mitchell tense slightly. "But that's not why I'm here. Instead, I'd like to invite you to something." The supervisor had moved closer now, listening intently. The backup officers, too, seemed drawn into this unexpected turn of events. A delivery truck honked in the distance, momentarily breaking the spell. But Davidson pressed on. "Next week, I'm leading a training session on interagency cooperation. We'll be discussing cases like the Highland Park scam, sharing resources, and talking about how local police and federal agents can work together more effectively." The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows now. Davidson could see the gathered crowd beginning to disperse, perhaps disappointed by the lack of conflict they'd expected to witness. Instead, they were seeing something far more powerful, a moment of transformation. "You know," Officer Mitchell spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice thoughtful, "I've worked this beat for 7 years. Never had an FBI agent invite me to training before." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, the first real break in his professional demeanor. The supervisor stepped forward then, introducing themselves. The conversation shifted, becoming more relaxed but no less significant. Davidson found herself explaining more about the Highland Park case, watching as local and federal law enforcement began to bridge a gap that had seemed so wide just moments before. Other officers began to join the discussion, their earlier defensive postures melting away. Questions about the fraud case mixed with broader discussions about jurisdiction and cooperation. What had started as a tense traffic stop was transforming into an impromptu planning session right there on the street. A young officer, probably fresh from the academy, was taking notes on her phone, clearly inspired by the unexpected turn of events. The morning traffic had continued to flow around them, drivers now passing a very different scene than the one that had first caught their attention. Davidson checked her watch. Her surveillance operation would need to be adjusted now. But somehow, she felt this delay might prove more valuable than any surveillance. She turned a potential confrontation into an opportunity for change, not through force or anger, but through understanding and professional respect. As the group began to break up, plans made for the upcoming training session, Davidson couldn't help but think about how differently this could have gone. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful response to tension isn't escalation or even asserting authority, it's finding common ground and building bridges. The following week arrived faster than anyone expected. Special Agent Davidson stood at the front of the FBI training facility's main conference room, watching as officers from various local precincts filed in. The room buzzed with conversation, coffee cups in hand, as law enforcement professionals from different agencies found their seats. Officer Mitchell arrived early, choosing a seat in the front row. The nervousness in his posture from their first encounter had been replaced with genuine interest. He brought along several of his fellow officers, each curious about this unexpected collaboration born from what could have been a disastrous encounter. "Good morning, everyone," Davidson began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "A week ago, I was involved in a traffic stop that could have gone very wrong." She paused, letting her words sink in. Instead, it became an opportunity for something much more important. The room fell silent, all eyes focused on her. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing statistics about interagency cooperation. "Every day, we pass each other on the streets. FBI, local police, state troopers, all of us working toward the same goal, but sometimes missing chances to work together." The morning light streamed through the windows, highlighting the earnest faces of her audience. A young officer raised her hand, asking about jurisdiction overlaps. Davidson smiled, remembering her own early days in law enforcement. "That's exactly the kind of question we need to discuss," she responded. "Let me tell you about a case we're working on right now, the Highland Park fraud investigation." As she detailed the case, Davidson noticed Officer Mitchell taking extensive notes. He'd already proved invaluable, sharing local insights about the neighborhood that her team hadn't considered. The room came alive with discussion, officers offering perspectives from their daily patrols that added new layers to the FBI's investigation. During the coffee break, conversations continued in small groups. Davidson overheard snippets about shared resources, better communication channels, and plans for regular joint briefings. What had started as a simple training session was evolving into something much more significant. "You know," a veteran sergeant mentioned while refilling his coffee cup, "I've been on the force for 20 years, and this is the first time I've seen federal and local law enforcement talk so openly." His words carried the weight of experience, understanding the rarity of such collaboration. The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. Davidson and Mitchell found themselves working together, demonstrating how their traffic stop could have been handled differently from the start. Their reenactment drew thoughtful questions and sparked discussions about assumptions, protocol, and the importance of clear communication. "The key moment wasn't when I showed my badge," Davidson explained to the attentive room. "It was when we started talking about why we were both there, protecting our community." Heads nodded in agreement, understanding dawning on faces around the room. As the training session wound down, plans were already being made for future collaborations. Officers exchanged contact information, breaking down the invisible barriers that had long separated different law enforcement agencies. The energy in the room was electric, filled with possibility and purpose. A local news crew had arrived to cover the event, drawn by rumors of this unique partnership. Davidson watched as Officer Mitchell confidently explained to the reporter how a potentially negative encounter had transformed into a catalyst for positive change. His words were genuine, reflecting the real impact of their shared experience. "This isn't just about one traffic stop or one training session," Davidson concluded, addressing the room one final time. "It's about recognizing that we're all on the same team, serving the same community." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, but the brightness in the room came from something more than just daylight. As people began gathering their things to leave, conversations continued. Plans were made for ride-alongs between FBI agents and local officers. The Highland Park fraud case had gained several new perspectives, with local officers offering to help with community outreach and surveillance. Standing by the door, Davidson and Mitchell watched their colleagues file out, many still deep in discussion about future collaborations. "You know," Mitchell said quietly, "when I pulled you over that morning, I never imagined it would lead to this." His words carried no defensiveness, only appreciation for how far they'd come in just a week. The training facility slowly emptied, but its impact would continue to ripple through the law enforcement community. What had started as a tense morning traffic stop had grown into something that would change how local and federal agencies work together, one conversation at a time. 1 month after the traffic stop incident, the changes in the local law enforcement community were impossible to miss. The FBI field office's conference room, once a space reserved solely for federal agents, now regularly hosted joint briefings with local police officers. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating a scene that would have seemed unlikely just weeks ago. Special Agent Davidson stood at her usual spot near the window, watching as officers and agents mingled before the morning briefing. The Highland Park fraud case had made significant progress thanks to the new collaboration. Local officers had provided crucial street-level intelligence that the FBI might have missed, while federal resources had helped expand the investigation's scope. "You wouldn't believe what we found yesterday," a patrol officer said excitedly to his FBI counterpart. "One of our regular neighborhood contacts mentioned seeing unusual activity at that coffee shop we've been watching." The natural flow of information between agencies had become second nature, replacing the old barriers of bureaucracy and mistrust. Officer Mitchell, now a regular face at these joint briefings, walked in carrying a stack of reports. He'd become an unexpected champion for interagency cooperation, sharing his experience with other precincts and encouraging them to build similar partnerships. The change in his demeanor was striking. Gone was the tense, suspicious officer from that morning traffic stop. In his place stood a confident professional who understood the value of collaboration. The morning's briefing focused on recent successes. 3 members of the fraud ring had been arrested, thanks to coordinated efforts between FBI surveillance teams and local patrol officers. More importantly, they'd managed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the briefing room as the day wound down. Officers and agents lingered, sharing stories and planning future operations. The atmosphere was relaxed but focused, professionals who had found common ground in their shared mission to protect and serve. A rookie officer approached Davidson with questions about the FBI Academy. The traffic stop incident had inspired several local officers to consider federal service, seeing it no longer as a separate path, but as another way to serve their community. Davidson smiled as she answered the young officer's questions, remembering her own journey and how it had led her to this unexpected role as a bridge between agencies. As people began gathering their things to leave, Mitchell caught Davidson's eye across the room. They shared a knowing look, both understanding how close they'd come to a very different outcome that morning. Instead, they'd created something remarkable, a template for turning potential conflict into lasting positive change. The sun was setting as the last officers left the building, casting an orange glow across the city they all worked to protect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but now they would face them together, not as separate agencies, but as one unified force for good in their community. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning traffic stop, and the changes it sparked had grown beyond anything Special Agent Davidson or Officer Mitchell could have imagined. The story of their encounter had traveled far beyond their city, inspiring police departments and FBI officers across the country to rethink how they worked together. On a crisp autumn morning, Davidson walked into a packed auditorium at the National Law Enforcement Conference. Hundreds of faces looked back at her, police officers, federal agents, and department heads from across the nation. They'd all come to hear about the program that had started with a single traffic stop and grown into a nationwide movement for change. "I never planned to create a training program," Davidson began, her voice carrying through the hushed room. "I just knew, in that moment on the street, that we had a choice. We could let tension and misunderstanding drive us apart, or we could find a way to work together." The audience leaned forward, drawn in by the authenticity in her words. Officer Mitchell stood at the back of the room, watching with pride. He'd changed too over these months. The officer who once approached every situation with suspicion now taught rookie cops about the importance of looking beyond first impressions. His experience had become a powerful teaching tool, showing how a potentially negative encounter could transform into something positive. Last week, Davidson continued, clicking to a new slide. "Our joint task force closed its 100th case." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. It's about the grandmother who didn't lose her savings because a local officer recognized the signs of fraud we discussed in training. It's about the federal agent who solved a case thanks to a tip from a beat cop who knew his neighborhood. The presentation screen showed photos of joint training sessions, community meetings, and successful operations. Each image told a story of barriers broken down and bridges built. In the audience, phones stayed quiet in pockets. Everyone was too engaged to be distracted by technology. The real success isn't in the statistics, Mitchell added, joining Davidson at the podium. It's in the change we see every day on the streets. He shared a story about a recent case where FBI resources and local knowledge had combined to stop a major crime ring. The cooperation had seemed natural routine, a far cry from the tension of that morning 6 months ago. During the break, officers and agents from other cities crowded around, eager to learn more. They shared their own stories of miscommunication and missed opportunities, seeing in Davidson and Mitchell's experience a path to better cooperation in their own communities. A senior police chief from another state approached Davidson, emotion clear in his voice. "I've been in law enforcement for 30 years, he said, and I've never seen federal and local agencies work together like this. We need this program in our city." Similar conversations were happening all around the room, seeds of change being planted across the country. The afternoon sessions focused on practical implementation. Davidson and Mitchell had developed a clear framework that any department could follow. "It's not about erasing our differences," Davidson explained. "It's about understanding how our different strengths can work together." They showed body camera footage from recent joint operations, pointing out moments of effective communication and cooperation. The audience watched intently as local officers and federal agents moved seamlessly together, their previous divisions forgotten in their shared mission to protect and serve. The day ended with a surprise announcement. The Department of Justice had taken notice of their program's success. Starting next month, their training model would be implemented at police academies nationwide. The room erupted in applause, not the polite kind, but the genuine appreciation of professionals who recognized real, meaningful change. As people filed out of the auditorium, many stopped to share how the presentation had affected them. "I saw myself in your story," one officer told Mitchell. "We've all had moments where we could have chosen a different path. You showed us what that path looks like." The sun was setting as Davidson and Mitchell gathered their materials. Through the windows, they could see groups of officers and agents still deep in conversation, exchanging contact information and making plans to implement what they'd learned. "Remember when you pulled me over?" Davidson asked with a smile. Mitchell shook his head, chuckling at the memory. Who would have thought that morning would lead to all this? Their story had become more than just a lesson in law enforcement cooperation. It had grown into a powerful reminder that every encounter, every moment of tension, carried the seed of positive change. All it took was the courage to choose understanding over confrontation and the wisdom to see past the surface to the common ground that lay beneath. As they walked out into the evening, they passed a group of rookie officers in animated discussion about the day's presentations. The future of law enforcement was changing, one conversation at a time, and it had all started with a traffic stop on an ordinary morning that turned out to be anything but ordinary.